Hi, hello and welcome and thank you for coming to today's webinar. I'm super excited today to be joined by Kim Saxton and Angeline Close Scheinbaum. Today we're going through and talking about a really important topic, how to write more successful and impactful JAR articles. So we're definitely in the business of trying to publish great research, and we want to help you and help everyone else in the community write papers that are more likely to get accepted. So some introductions first. First off, Kim Saxton. So in addition to being a JER associate editor, thank you for doing that, Kim. Kim is a marketing strategy professor at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. She believes marketers should make data-driven decisions to improve their effectiveness. Her research focuses on market segmentation, how to communicate to segments, and the role of marketing in startup success. Next up, we've got Angeline. Thank you for being here, Angeline. In addition to being a JAR ERB member and winner of our Best Reviewer Award, thank you as well. Angeline is the Duncan Professor of Sports Marketing in the Wilbur O. and Ann Powers College of Business at Clemson University. Angeline has co-authored numerous articles, book chapters, books, and also a textbook. And I believe you also have a book as well, teach, Kim, right? Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome, so many authors, I love it. So thank you both for joining us today and sharing your expertise on what makes for a more successful JAR article. Before we get into that discussion, I wanted to just briefly plug some things that are happening at JAR. So one is this T-Vision data release. This is really kind of a neat initiative. What we have is T-Vision's agreed to release data. And if you're not familiar, T-Vision goes through and has trackers in 5,000 households in the US, and they track second-by-second viewership of TV and streaming content. And they've agreed to release that to academic authors who have interesting ideas and want to use that data to basically further understanding of attention and how people respond to advertising. So if you're interested, take a look. That's on our website, journalofadvertisingresearch.com. We also have a call for papers on pro-social advertising messages. This is edited by Marla Ron Stafford. This is open right now. It's open until I think May. But again, more details are on our website. You can take a look at that if you're interested in doing any research related to pro-social advertising messages. And we also have a call for papers on the future of advertising using VR, AR, and the metaverse. And this is being co-edited by Kirsten, Anna, and Kirk. And again, more details on that are on our website, journalofadvertisingresearch.com. You can take a look at this. This one, I think, closes a little bit later in the summer. And then finally, some exciting news that will be coming out soon. You're hearing it here first. We're doing a writer's workshop on crafting industry relevant research in conjunction with the ICORIA conference in Bordeaux this year. This will be June 29th. It's a pre-conference workshop. We'll have more details coming out on that soon. But if you're thinking about going to ICORIA or we're debating, hopefully this could be something that pushes you over the edge. It's going to be an afternoon where we're going to have all three editors will be there, Jizu and Ray as well. And we're going to go through and focus on tips to go through and make your research more relevant to industry. We're also going to go through and have a workshop session as well too, where people can share their ideas and get feedback from AEs and editors and other participants as well. But back to today's webinar, we are focused on going through and writing more successful and impactful JAR articles. I am super excited for today's session because I think my first two JAR articles I ever submitted were rejected, rightly so, because they weren't that strong. And I think there's a lot of things that people often don't know, at least I didn't know. And I think we can share some advice and tips to make it more likely that your papers are accepted. We want to accept your papers. We want cool research coming through. We want to have an easier sort of path through the review process. And we're super excited to go through and share advice that we've got. We also want to encourage you, if you've got questions, to go through and throw those in the Q&A. We took a look at all of the questions that you sent through when you registered. Thank you so much for doing that. And we've integrated those in. But of course, feel free to include questions that you might have in that chat window. And we'll be happy to go through and try and address those throughout the session. Cool, so I'm going to stop sharing and we'll dive in. And I think we'll start off by taking a look at the very first step. I think probably the best frame is kind of to go through and think about that process of writing and submitting a paper. I think it really starts off with going through and first off designing a study. So I think the first question we've got here is, what can authors do to increase the likelihood that their paper is going to be successful when they're first designing or thinking about how they want to shape a study?
Yeah, so I can share a couple things that I think hit reviewers pretty hard when they see a study based on topics. So I can remember a paper in the last year where it seemed like maybe someone had a paper in their desk drawer. And so they took it out and said, oh, where could this possibly go? And it was about game theory in how ad agencies operate. So people pretty much thought that topic was kind of odd for the Journal of Advertising Research. So I think the first thing is to really make sure that the Journal of Advertising Research is a good outlet for the topic that you're interested in, and that it has to have something that's advertising at its core. Could be ad agencies, could be creativity, but I mean, advertising is a really broad thing. But to bring in a lot of game theory, for example, was not like really what people thought that readers of JR would be excited about.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point. And something that Colin mentioned in his Meet the Editors session with the American Marketing Association Winter Educators Conference was making sure that it's industry relevant. So something that sets JAR apart from many of our other journals, even ones that really preach a lot about industry, I genuinely feel that JAR is authentic in this vision and the execution of it. So to this question about how do we design studies that we can contribute to a journal that has industry relevance like JAR, one of the greatest pieces of feedback I learned at that session is don't wait until the very end to start thinking about your managerial implications. If you do, if you get to the point after 20 pages, right, and a couple of years of studies and design and literature review, and then if you feel like, I don't have any managerial recommendations, then to Kim's point, JAR might not be the best fit for that. The ones that are more organically designed, and I'll give you a couple examples of this, of papers in JAR. There are a lot of papers in the journal that seem to do a lot of like field studies or that have corporate backed data. And so with those, you know that organically within the design, if a company is willing to sponsor it or pay for the data collection and or use it somewhat in a consultative type manner, then you know that there's an organic interest in there from industry. So then that section of implications becomes so easy, it almost writes itself.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And people should realize that we are putting practitioners as reviewers on every paper, because for that practical relevance. And so they might not have as many issues with some of the literature reviews and things like that, but they often, have some problems with the dependent variables that are being used because they don't view them as being important and interesting enough.
And the samples, in my experience with JAR as an author, not as a reviewer for a minute here, I can almost always tell who are the industry reviewers, right? Like, I don't know who they are, of course, we're in a blind process, but you can kind of get a sense that this is an expert who is doing advertising and doing marketing and doing experiential marketing and selling sponsorship, whatever it is that we're focusing on. And my personal experience, those have been the toughest reviewers, right? Now, they might not push you too hard on the theory, right? But they are so good at the big picture. So what? What do we care? Why do we care? And how are we going to change our ad agency's operations differently? How are we going to service our clients differently? How are we going to do our creative work differently? How are we going to do our media buys and investments differently? That's what they want to know. And I also like the implementation ability that a lot of the industry reviewers will pick up on. A lot of times, the more academic reviewers don't always pick up on these things, but are you actually able to do these recommendations? So for example, you often always see these wonderful, grandiose expectations. So in conclusion, we believe that Super Bowl investments are a must, X, Y, Z. And most people would agree, yeah, that's great. But in the real world, does your client have that budget for this $6 million media investment just for the media time? So I think your point is spot on in that we need two types of things, but are those practitioner reviewers helping you see the forest through the trees? And I think they're really good at that. And a lot of other journals don't have that.
Yeah, I can remember one of my papers, they actually made us do the financial implications of our recommendations. And then we were like, hope we came up with the right ones. Let's like double check that. We did the math and then we're like, oh, hey, the financial actually backs our strategic. So lucky us, but thank God that the reviewer pointed out that that is an aspect that should be looked at.
Mm-hmm.
No, definitely really, really important points. And I think the relevance is a huge one, right? It's is this something that advertisers actually care about? Is it going to change how they go through and do their practice? And this is something all of us are looking at when we're evaluating these papers that come in. Other things as well, too, I wanted to point out would be taking a look at the actual design of the studies, right? So one of the things we often see is, I was just talking about before we started here, was I'll see one sample studies come in that are analyzed using SEM or PLS, which can be interesting, but usually alone is not enough to go through and change how you might do practice. Right. So I think you really want to think about, you've got, perhaps a cool sort of effect that comes through with an initial study that's done using SEM or PLS, but can you follow that up with experiments or something else to give a little bit more, strength to the implications that you're able to then provide? Proving causality is really helpful. I'd also encourage authors to go through and take a look at creating stimuli that are perhaps more realistic, right? And that can be actioned, as Kim points out as well, too.
Yeah, and along the lines with the stimuli, I think one of the red flags I frequently see from reviewers is when there are no manipulation checks.
Yeah.
So make sure your stimuli are doing the things that you say they're going to do. I mean, I do occasionally see some results where, the results are pretty weak. Maybe there's a difference. It's pretty marginal. And then I look at the stimuli and I'm like, oh, I don't think these stimuli got tested very well. Otherwise, you would know that there's not a big enough difference between them to get the effect that you want. So going back to that design, and it's okay to take more time and pre-tests and things like that to make sure your stimuli are doing what they're supposed to do so that you can infer that causality.
Mm-hmm.
And check for confounds as well, too. Something we see as well, too. If there's other differences besides whatever it is you're manipulating that's present, you want to test for that and check that those are not, driving whatever effect it is that we're seeing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One other thing about JAR. Oh, go ahead, Colin.
No, it's okay. Go for it. Yeah.
Always the awkward Zoom over talking here. So one thing I love about JAR, for anyone out there who loves branding, like a lot of us do, what I like about JAR is consistently over the years, they have been very open to working with real brands and disclosing that this is a study that we did in partnership with Volkswagen or Ford or AT&T. Whereas at some journals, you might get a little bit of a pushback as to saying something like, well, why don't you make a fake brand, right? And do some stimuli on this fake brand. But JAR has been very receptive to those types of papers that are almost using these real brands somewhat as a case study, but much deeper than that theoretically, of course. But that's always been very nice. In fact, at JAR, we see people complimented for that, not necessarily shunned for that. I like the realism. I really like the realism. When I think it was Kim who just talked about the realisticness of the stimuli, that's a problem, right? Because there are just so many things right now in this field that you can't easily do a scenario with. I'll give you an example. Say in the sports field, imagine you're at a stadium with 82,500 people, right? Like the one I'm in right now, virtually. There's mega experience going on. There's sensory experience. There's billboards. There's sponsorship activation. There's ads galore everywhere. It's so much harder to replicate that in a scenario-based stimuli. So imagine you're at the stadium and imagine your team is losing and imagine it's raining and imagine you're starving. Are you more likely or less likely to buy this concession-related product? Almost always in my 15, 17 years of experience doing these with scenarios and then replicating them or attempting to in the field, they don't necessarily align. And my solution and my explanation for that is the real difficulty of some of these scenarios, getting people to read the scenarios. I've started actually putting timers on Qualtrics and within whatever survey mechanism, because getting to Kim's awesome point about manipulation checks, that we were actually finding in some instances, that participants from the lab were attempting to complete studies without exposing themselves to the required stimuli. So it took me a few years to figure this out, but some tips really that I want to stress to authors is make these stimuli realistic. If you've got to do a scenario, which works and sometimes, try your best to really get all elements of what you're trying to get the person to feel. And then lastly, add that timer or some other mechanism to ensure that they're not able to proceed, especially with the dependent variable, unless you know that they watched that video, right? Or they really engaged with that scenario. It's not a perfect solution, but that could be one simple mechanism to help us have better stimuli. Because if we have bad stimuli, we have bad research.
Yeah. So Angeline, there are two things I like to do with that to build on what you had to say. I mean, I agree. We have put timers as well. And even something where it's only one sentence, it's still, some people were doing like 1/10 of a second. I mean, faster than any of us can read. So it doesn't hurt to give them a little overexposure there, I would say. But secondly, we throw in sometimes a thought question immediately after the stimuli. In part to kind of ground their thinking a little bit, but also because then we can take out the ones who were thinking about dribble, right? Mm-hmm. We just saw the stimuli. So what did you just see? What does it make you think of? And, you're talking about what I'm going to make for dinner tonight, which is something completely different than we know they weren't really processing the information.
Or they weren't a human being.
Right?
Yeah.
Have y'all seen some of the studies that have come out? I know we're going to be talking about samples, so hopefully this is a natural organic transition to that. So there is some research out that is suggesting and showing that bots are taking, say, MTurk type studies. And so one of the simplest solutions to this is exactly what Kim just said, is to add an open-ended question that a human being would need to know, right? It's almost like the CAPTCHA thing. And you're able to use that to kind of screen out who might be real and what might be a bot looking to make an extra quarter for taking your study.
Right. And here's a clue. When they put in JKLMNOP, that's also not a real human being or not one caring enough to be included in your survey and your analysis.
Exactly. Yeah, that's very true. And that's a perfect lead in, as you mentioned, Angeline, to, there's a question we had in the registration, which was about what kind of panel data is allowed, right? We're open to any type of data at JAR. We care about a couple things though. One is the quality of your sample and the checks that you've done to ensure that it isn't a bot or isn't people going through and speeding through your survey. The other one, of course, is going to be the fit with whatever it is you're investigating. So if you're investigating a topic, the sample should be reasonably appropriate to that, right? Ideally, we'd like to have more generalizable samples if you can, that you're drawing from. So larger ones, but of course, sometimes it makes sense to have more specific ones, but just you want to have a good fit between that and what it is you're researching and what you're focusing on. I'd also encourage you to go through and rotate. Perhaps you don't use all of one particular source. Maybe you've got different sources, and that way you can sort of triangulate across those different samples that you're using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in our research, we tend to have a methodology that's like, try it on the students, then try it on MTurk. And then, when you really feel like you've got the piece, go get a Qualtrics. That's just the tools I use. I'm not saying there are other tools that would be equally good, but that idea of sort of layering up, taking the risk out of the money that you have to spend by getting smarter on the earlier stages so that when you do spend the money, you get the results you want.
Yeah,
but then you also have 3 studies.
That's true, which gives much more legitimacy to whatever it is we're finding in that paper as well. We had some questions about qual versus quant. JAR is open to all types of research, right? We're open to qualitative research, we're open to quantitative, we're open to conceptual, although I caution those can be much more challenging to go through and write. But any type of research that furthers our understanding of advertising and that potentially helps both practice and also contributes to theory we're totally open to a JAR. For qualitative papers was a question around the success of those at JAR. Qualitative work can be really, really powerful when it's done well. At the same time, though, a lot of qualitative papers that I see come in are too descriptive. and they don't push beyond simply describing what's happening with the data. Qualitative research tends to usually be used when you're going in and taking a look at a brand new phenomenon to try to understand what's happening and get a sense of the mechanism or process that's going on with a particular phenomenon. Or it could be that you're going back and revisiting something to try and understand confusing results or confusing things that you're seeing, or to perhaps revisit something that might have changed because of the internet or social media and stuff like that. So typically it's going to be something new or something that's changed. And typically you want to push beyond just being descriptive to instead going through and trying to explain or develop new insights, like new constructs, things like that, to really sort of push our understanding of a certain phenomenon further. Anything either of you want to add on that?
Yeah, I would add that the ones I don't send out for review are the qualitative papers where, they interviewed 12 people. They have these very grandiose, results, and that we're supposed to take as gospel, when I know that very likely a quantitative study that followed up on it would find something extremely different. So if it feels like it is actually a whole study in and of itself, even though it's qualitative, that's fine. But if it feels like it was the first step of a quantitative paper, you can't just cut the 2 in half and have 2 papers. The qualitative research doesn't stand by itself in those cases. And that's partly because you said it is mostly descriptive, but also frequently I've seen that the results are overstated. And so, this is just a clue. This isn't, validated. So if you're going to do a qualitative paper, at least just say, this is the first step in what we've learned. Don't treat it like it was a full quant study.
Absolutely. And to build on that, which is so spot on, is sometimes we see in the review process a qualitative study where the authors attempt to use more quantitative terminology or verbiage or interpretations of qualitative. It is a completely different process. One is phenomenon driven, right? Like as Colin said, it's a new phenomenon. Why are people doing this? And it's really to get in deep about that, but to use illustrative quotes and then tie it back to the theory and to literature to tell your story with words. When we see papers that come through that are qualitative in its approach, but then sometimes the back end of the paper reads more like attempts to fit it in a hypothesis testing box, or saying things like 14% of our 12 respondents believe that X, Y, Z, but we've got to look at the basic sample needs in order to even report in terms of quantitative measuring. So I would say pick one of 3 options. Option 1, do an awesome qualitative paper with illustrative quotes that are very rich and deep, where you feel like you know the person, right? Like you can feel their emotion coming through their words. Like in our Valentine's Day quotes, it's almost like you could hear these young ladies' tears coming through when they didn't get a date on Valentine's Day. So the emotion just is pumped through that, not just 10% of women feel expectations of getting Valentine's. That's not as rich. Option 2, do your quant paper, right? And try to refrain from getting into those illustrative quotes. But option 3, which I love, but we don't see a lot of, because in all fairness, it's hard. And I definitely don't advise this for current doctoral students, just for dissertations, but the mixed method approach, right? So having one study be qualitative, and you do the rich things if you have space, and then follow it up with a quant.
Yeah,
right.
That can be very powerful. We had a question as well too about taking a look at a person who had gone through and done some research and wanted to see if they were concerned that perhaps the theoretical conclusions were not as groundbreaking. I would caution that for a qualitative study, if the findings are largely things we already know or can intuit based on existing literature, it may not be enough, right? So I would encourage you, if you're doing qualitative, it usually has to be something that's going to be providing new, deep, rich insights that are things that perhaps we haven't learned before. So it may not necessarily be a good fit if that's the case. And I'm wondering if Kim or Angeline have anything to add on in terms of that question.
Well, I think contribution is a very important thing. And, when I see reviewers not really being excited about a paper, it's usually because they think the contribution is too low. And that usually comes from 2 places. Either, it's not groundbreaking, we already know all this, or that it takes so long to figure out what the contribution was that there's a mismatch between the length of the paper and the ideas that are formed. I think everybody wants something that's really interesting and groundbreaking. We recently had a paper published on ASMR. Well, I mean, ASMR is like a whole new phenomenon. And I think if you were doing something really unique and different, that maybe the paper doesn't have to be as strong, because maybe we want to learn what we can about ASMR and there's almost nothing written, or social media influencers, right? There's also not a ton there. So if you take an area that's not well understood, it's easier for your contribution to stand out than if you are just replicating something for the nth time without adding something really new to it.
Mm-hmm. Another point with qualitative that's specific to this journal is if we think about our samples, you've got a great opportunity to sample creative directors, media planners, and all of the agency type industry folks. And those come out to be some really, really awesome qualitative studies. There's a lot of studies that you see in other journals where the qualitative sample is the end user or the consumer. Of course, there are some of those in JAR as well, but those tend to be fewer and far between. But when we do see the qualitative studies in JAR over the years, historically, the sample has actually been ad agency practitioners.
Yeah. And a good thing to add on to that as well, too, which is a really important point, is that if you can get people to talk to you about your topic from industry, then they probably care about it. And that's going to make it much easier to go through, and you write those implications at the end as well, too. Because I've had great success going through and messaging people on LinkedIn or even through emails as well. But if they care about the topic, something that's also causing them to wonder and they want to find out, they're going to be interested to go through and talk to you and also find out your findings at the end as well.
Absolutely. And there's a big push in a lot of the top journals lately for what we call ecological validity. If you're interested in the topic, there was a fabulous article that came out in the Journal of Marketing the last couple of years, basically saying, what is ecological validity and how can we establish it? It's one of those many types of validities that we all learned during our PhD program. And I feel like that's the one that we've kind of forgotten about a little bit. But one of the coolest tips in that paper is that if you're able to take your study and your findings and bring it to a practitioner and really disseminate it among multiple audiences, maybe say with some of the conferences like the Advertising Insights Conference with ARF, or outside of academia. So if you can prove that your work is speaking to multiple stakeholders, or at least something beyond us as academics, that's one way where you can add with really just 2 sentences in your paper that this paper or this research has been disseminated outside of academia and feedback taken in with that. And I feel like that will kind of help you one step closer to what we talked about earlier, this big idea of industry related relevance.
Yeah, great idea.
We had a couple quick questions I just want to jump through here. So one is about sample size. Qualitative sample size, usually generally the rule I have is around 30. And then in terms of more quantitative studies, typically I've heard it's around 50, even as high as 100 per condition nowadays, I'm saying. I'm curious as to what both of you have in your experience.
I like the number 30 as a starting place. So I think it depends on if you have subpopulations, right? So I've seen sometimes where there's 30 and there's really 4 subpopulations. So, you don't
That's true.
have even an N of 10. It's always hard with qualitative. I mean, personally, I find that after about the 8th interview, I get a little bored because I feel like I'm hearing 90% of the same stuff, and trying to get that last 10% out is, pretty rough. But I think the bigger issue on the quantitative sample size is back to power. I mean, sometimes, I've worked in organizations that always wanted 50 or 100, but logically, I mean, we know that probably you need 270 or 400 sometimes. And so depending on what you're looking at, if the effect isn't that big, then yeah, you need a bigger sample in order to even see the effect. I mean, I wish we could all work on effects that were ginormous. I mean, it's not like a clinical trial. In my experience, those effects tend to be rather large or nothing. And in social science, I get excited about a 0.3 correlation. So I think we actually need bigger samples in order to detect some of the differences.
That's very true. And with qualitative, going back to the point earlier, I really think I would rather have a smaller sample that's relevant and awesome than one that's a little bit bigger. I'll give you an example. I would love to see a paper that's industry focused, for example, that has a sample including the people running Gray Worldwide or DDB Needham or Leo Burdett Agency or some of these fabulous agencies that have years of experience. I would rather see a sample of maybe the leading top 10 ad agency creative directors and picking their brains rather than a sample of 100 interviews of interns, right? So to me, I'm not really always a heuristics person. I like to look at the big picture, and I'm not one to say, all right, I'm going to cut or reject or not advocate for the study because it only has 10 people. Again, if those 10 people are the rock stars in the field, then we want to hear from those and we can benefit. And then over to quant, I definitely agree. You need to do that power analysis. You need to make sure you have an adequate number per the cells, but also think of the analysis type that you're doing and make sure that it's not overly sensitive to sample size. For example, the chi-square test is notorious for this.
Right.
Awesome. We've got questions about bibliometric papers and also neuroscience papers. We're open to all types of papers. It really comes down to the contribution and what are you able to add to the conversation on whatever topic it is related to advertising that you're studying. So bibliometric, those can be kind of tough. Sometimes people I find focus too much on the numbers and don't get into the so what. So I would encourage people to definitely push beyond just going through and having the charts and tables and things like that. There's some really good articles on how to do good lit reviews as well too. I would encourage you to go through and take a look at those. And then in terms of neuroscience, again, I'm open to it. I'm curious as to what both of you think.
In fact, John Ford ran a special session or a special issue about 5 years ago on advertising in neuroscience. So I would recommend to that inquiring author to check that out and build on that story, because that's one of the cool things with JAR is you're able to kind of get into this really nice community and you read the literature on that, say in neuroscience and advertising, synthesize those papers, not just from JAR, but from the advertising literature in general, you know, not all of marketing, but pay attention to advertising journals as well, because I do think that that's a turnoff for a lot of us who are focusing squarely in the advertising space and advertising journals. We want to see these lit reviews that come in looking at something like neuroscience, but from the advertising lens. So pulling papers from International Journal of Advertising, Journal of Advertising Research, JCERA, and Journal of Interactive Marketing tend to be 5 examples of commonly cited papers that we like to see within the advertising space. But take your idea and position around those set of synergized papers and then kind of build the story, adding to the advertising scholarship conversation. We see a lot in the lit review process or the review process with this journal of really nice lit reviews, but once you kind of get down to the references, if you see that one, advertising journals are not even being mentioned, that's a turnoff to me. And I'm not just saying JAR. I mean, yes, that's nice, right? To flip through and see that they've at least consulted the journal that they're sending to. That's probably not a wise idea to send a paper that doesn't have at least one, because it shows that you're familiar with the journal and the other types of works that you're building on. But if not JAR, at the very least include proper advertising scholarship, not just from psychology, sociology, economics, and or marketing.
Yeah, I can think of 2 papers that got a lot of pushback. One was the lit review didn't have anything that was more recent than 10 years ago, right? And so this paper needs to be updated because probably something has happened in the last decade. But also the same thing, which is that, you know, all this data, all the references are coming out of other fields and making the case. I mean, that's hard. If you're bringing a new idea from another field to advertising, there might not be much that's in advertising, but then you need to like cloak it in some theory of advertising. So we know that you understand not just this other new idea from another field, but you understand advertising with this other thing. So I think often it makes sense to make sure that you kind of cloaked it in an advertising theory.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's very important to go through and make sure that it actually, touches and relates to the existing conversations that are occurring in advertising. Yeah. We have a couple questions. It's a good segue that have just come in talking about working with practitioners and trying to get advice on how to go through and collaborate with them. And if that's a good thing that we obviously want to see, which we do, but we've got some great expertise on the panel today. So I'm curious to hear tips and advice you have for working with practitioners.
I can go on that one, and then Kim, you can feel free to follow up, because I think my story is unique. But yes, I'm one of those researchers. I'm one of the people who have one foot firmly in industry and one foot in academia. Maybe it's because I couldn't decide what to do with my life, so I just decided to do a bit of both. So I'll kind of tell you my story and then see if maybe you can learn from that or figure out ways to do it. So I started consulting in 2005 when the new Dodge Charger was being introduced. God, that's a long time ago. I'm aging myself here on this. But I will tell you that it was pro bono and it was volunteer type work in exchange for the data. And once you do a really great job with an industry collaboration, word of mouth tends to build. And then the next thing you know, AT&T was asking, and Suzuki and Subaru and Volkswagen and Lexus, among some other big brands. And that, along with following up with actionable tips in a timely manner, has proved very important. So it's almost like you're serving two masters when we're doing this type of research. Why we are in it as scholars most of the time is for the data, and for the data that is publishable. I've learned to make sure that if you are signing a non-disclosure agreement, that you're still willing to do that work, because for a lot of you, if you're motivated by data, I would hate for you to find yourself in a situation where I've been before, where you're spending a year working with a company, helping them manage a study and run a study, but then you're asked to sign an NDA and not get that publishing rights. So again, I think 3 things that you can learn from my tips here. One is volunteer. I know it doesn't sound fun. In fact, I just had a meeting with a advertising student, and she's like, I have great news, but bad news at the same time. I was like, okay, what's going on? And they said, well, I got an internship for a major sports marketing team in the Southeast, but the bad news is it's unpaid. And I actually shared my same story. I said, look, I hate this. I know it feels like free labor right now, but even, a lot of us have done that. Volunteer, do awesome, and then continue those relationships. I'm going in 2 weeks to run the National Cycling League event with that same set of corporate people from 2005. And it's just crazy that we're going on now almost like 2 decades of this, but a lot of this is trust, relationship building. Point 2 is time. Practitioners want it due yesterday. They want you to run that study. They want it they don't have time for coding. You can't use paper anymore. And they want the analysis of those results to get to their stakeholders as soon as the project is done. Whereas as academics, I think a lot of us are on a little bit longer timetable. We take a few weeks to think about the theory and things like that. So I've learned from experience, you've got to take it in prong A and prong B. Prong A, get out the descriptive stats, let the practitioners know what they want to know in a quickly manner. And then step B is to take your time and unpack it in a nice story for a completely different audience. So I know it's not always easy. They're not going to just fall in your lap. You've got to get out there. You got to hustle. And in my experience, offering to volunteer has really set me up for the ability to have some really nice industry experience. And I know we're not here to talk about teaching, but I will say that students love it. They want to hear those war stories about the research, the failures, and the success points, right? They love hearing the story about the time I rented $2,000 worth of tablets in the middle of a cycling race and was running around and no one could read it because the glare of the sun on the screens that I had bought were unreadable. So I'm like going to FedEx and making 2,000 copies at like $1 a piece, right? So it's stories like that where you learn working from industry. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But again, I think it's awesome. It's going to help your research. It's going to help support your financials for your research. If some of you are not at R1 research schools with research budgets, that's been the workaround to that. I know I started my career at a non-research school or a balanced school, and I didn't have a research budget. That's why I volunteered, is I got that data, and I didn't make much money with it, but it also helped me from not spending money on Qualtrics type samples.
Yeah, I would echo that, you know, occasionally these fall in your lap, but you pretty much do have to go hunt them down. During COVID, I really wanted to do some work on, see if there was a way that we could use some behavioral economics and nudge people to the COVID vaccine. So I was able to work with our local public health organization, because I posted on their social media site. I said, if you want help with the rolling out the children's vaccine, please let me know. The next thing you know, we were executing a live field experiment with them. They had no money either. I went and got industry partners to do the money. But I think two things that are really important that need to be brought up when you are doing this kind of work is that you still need that working with practitioners drives you to phenomenological research, which is not going to be publishable in an academic journal unless you've got, you know, a theory. So for example, we were using construal theory. And so it was really important to have some high construal versus some low construal, where they really wanted us to do all low construal. So I was like, but, you know, if you can't get that piece in, then that's going to be a bit of a challenge. And this, because of that was working so well, I also went to a Medicaid organization where I had an alum who was the chief medical officer. And we started down a road with them. And actually we did some work for free, but then the lawyers got involved. And so between the IU lawyers who, you know, were trying to protect our rights to publish, and the company who was trying to protect their reputation because they want to know what all the results were before they would agree to publish them, you know, we just weren't able to move forward. So we wasted a little time, but what you don't want to do is, as you said, spend a year and then discover that you can't use it. So those are the two things I would say, is that make sure that you have some theoretical foundation that you're able to test so that you can publish it, and then protect yourself to make sure that you can publish it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, that's hard to do, because this is what's going to happen. And this almost always happens. You go to the literature, you're a scholar, right? You do your proper lit review, and you know, this is how you measure satisfaction. It's a 5-item scale. Everybody knows the scale in the industry. You present it to your managerial team for the pre-test, and they say, oh, I think there's an error. You've actually asked a satisfaction questions like 5 times. You can just cut this, and this. Thinking about parsimony in the field, right? But then I've learned, I used to be a little bit more hesitant to push back, right? And say things like, oh, okay, and just cut it. And then you get in the review process, right? The first thing the reviewer correctly says is, you know, why are you using only 1 or 2 items to measure something like satisfaction, which we know should be, say, 5. So I've learned over the years to respectfully push back on that. Say, look, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. And I found myself turning down a lot of jobs for that, because again, I think most of our motivation in this is not the monetary compensation, but the data. You know, we're like the people on the side of the road, we'll work for data. And to us, that's a big deal. And sloppy data in as sloppy data out. And none of us really want to waste our time with that. So again, if you start working with a client and they start really micromanaging your questions and your scales, and they'll do that. Even the most prominent companies will do this. They'll say, oh, you know, the way we measure satisfaction at our company is, and you ask it and you look at it, you're like, this is a double-barreled question. This, like, it looks a little bit good for you as the company, but there's really, it's like, my satisfaction level is A, awesome, B, extremely awesome. It's like, that's not how it works. So push back, cover yourself, and make sure that the data you're going to get on the back end is going to be workable and usable.
Yeah, I have to laugh. I did one time tell one of my clients, look, I own the chalk. Okay. So I can take my chalk away, or we can let me have the chalk, please.
It's tough though. It definitely is tough. I think, and I definitely echo what you both said about NDAs. I would encourage you to get that done beforehand before getting into it, because it would be terrible, like to have the experience you described, Angeline, to go through and work on stuff. So I think definitely having a clause where you can always publish the data, even if it's anonymous, right? And definitely if they want to be public about it, they can, but at least having that right to go through and publish it in an anonymized fashion would be very important to have. In terms of finding partners, I think that can definitely be tough. I think about MBA students and alumni as a great source. That could be something you could go through in mind. Going through industry events is really important as well too. Think about like local AMA events that they do for industry professionals. ARF events or MSI events, right, can be useful as well too. And also, like, I know people push back in the chat on this, but like going out and actually just cold, messaging or cold emailing or even phone calling to companies, if you know that they care about a certain thing and they're working in that area, if you can find the right person, which might take a bit of time to go through and do, they hopefully will be interested in that as well too. I think that really goes back to just knowing, that you're looking at a topic that industry cares about and that is current and that is relevant. And I'd also encourage you to go through and just exactly as Angeline and Kim have said, is, think about the value you're offering them. There's going to be some stuff that they care about that you don't, and there's going to be some stuff that you care about that they don't, but hopefully you can be able to go through and find that middle ground and provide insights that are relevant to them. And think about, as Angeline points out, right, the fact that they care about it yesterday. Right. So you want to be able to go through and, before you've got it through review and accepted, provide them with your findings, maybe prepare a slide deck they can use or whatever kind of output they care about, but give back that value, because it's so much easier once you've done, at least I found, once I've done one paper with industry, because I can then use that as an example to talk to other people and tell them more about the process and what they're going to get out of it and the benefits to them as well.
Absolutely. But do be prepared to educate them. So I've had a few where I'm like, but in order for this to work, we need your website to do X, Y, and Z. How fast can you turn that around?
Yeah, it can take a while. Or even getting secondary data or data that they've got as well can take a while too. Sometimes just to pull that and get it in the right format, things like that. But it can be really cool when you do get, rich data from industry. I'm conscious of time, so I want to jump to some of our other topics. In terms of the process, so just in terms of for people who may not be aware, when a paper comes into JAR, it comes in to the editorial team. They'll go through and check it for formatting, all that kind of stuff that it fits. Then it will go through to me. Basically the criteria I'm looking at when a paper comes in is it interesting? Is it something that contributes to theory and practice, right? And is it of enough quality to justify potentially going out for review? I'm purposely trying to be more open to different types of research that come in and different sort of papers that might be otherwise on the border, and give them to AEs to take a look at these sort of borderline papers to give the benefit of the doubt to authors. This is one of the reasons why you've seen that we've basically doubled the size of our AE ranks, and so we can give more chances to papers and give more benefit of the doubt to authors. What this means, though, is that obviously AEs are going to be taking a look at the papers that are on that borderline case, and also the ones that come through that are stronger, and they then decide if they want to send it out, and they can also desk reject it and send it back as well too if they don't think it's strong enough to go. They then would go through and decide on who those reviewers are, and then bring that together and summarize that in their AE report. I'm curious, Kim, if you want to give more insight into the process you go through when you're deciding whether or not to send out a paper and who to send it to.
Well, I have to admit, after my first couple of years as a reviewer, where I was like, reject, 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 I was like, gosh, this is hard on me and hard on them. So as an AE, I really think very carefully that if I send out a paper that I know for sure is going to get rejected, I'm wasting the reviewer's time. So I kind of look at 3 levels. Like it's like, I'm going to give them really deep feedback. In fact, I think you and I talked about this recently. I think I did a reject and resubmit before sending it out. It was like, all right, there's some nugget here. So let me give you a long list of the things that you're going to have to jump through in order for this to go out to the reviewers. And then if there's a paper where I think, I think it's got some weaknesses, but I think that they could really use the reviewers' feedback in order to make this be something really good, then I'll send it out to the reviewers. And there are occasional times where I suspect it's going to come back as a reject from the reviewers, but I think that the review process was good on both sides. And then there's ones where I think there's a good chance that, you know, it just needs to be tightened up. And so the reviewers are going to really help. So I sort of think there's definitely not, maybe not, probably yes, are my 3 buckets. And so, and then, you know, most often those probably yeses have a couple of rounds of reviews. Although sometimes, you know, after the first revision, you know, sometimes the papers get to be a conditional accept. So I'm not hesitant to go to a conditional accept if they've really done 90% of the work. I don't think the review process, I can tell you one of my last papers that just got done, we were on the 9th version that finally got published, the 9th version. I don't really think that's a very fair review process.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
From the reviewer perspective, so once it goes from the editor to the AE and then after review, I'm curious, Angeline, if you want to talk about a little bit, or if you could talk a little bit about the kind of process you go through as a reviewer when taking a look at a paper.
Absolutely. I tend to look at it a few different times. We typically take about 3 to 4 weeks as reviewers of this, specifically 28 days. And most of us understand that time is of the essence. We're all authors as well. So we, try to meet those deadlines. But the way that I like to do reviewing is in 3 different steps. So step 1, before accepting the review, I always want to make sure that it's in my area of expertise. Specific for me, that's integrated brand promotion, experiential marketing with a strong emphasis in sponsorship, and sometimes e-commerce. So first, I want to make sure that I have the expertise. I'm definitely not too proud to admit to someone like Colin, who have known a really long time, is, hey, you know, he hasn't done this, of course, but this paper is about topic Y, which is completely out of my skill set. So that's step 1. And at that time, that's when I do a very quick first read. Like, it's really more of like just flipping through, glancing. I love frameworks. I love diagrams, and I know I'm not alone. Research shows 70% of us are visual processors. In fact, if you've read my advertising and integrated brand promotion book, you see there's frameworks everywhere, right? Frameworks galore. Students are like, do I have to know this framework and this one and this? Like, yes, right? Just look at this. So I'm a big believer for step 2, almost reviewing it backwards. The second time I look at it is I spend almost more time in the back matter. A new trend, not in JAR, thank God, but I'm seeing in some other supplementary journals, is this idea of a web appendix as a way to circumvent the page limit that's being enforced. As a reviewer, I find those extremely taxing when somebody sends 20-page of web appendices that may or may not actually help. But what I really do look for in those appendices, not necessarily web appendices at that stage, is making sure that they're at least disclosing the survey questions, the means, medians, modes, standard deviations, alphas, and/or critical ratios, and the stimuli if it's an experiment. I want to see your stimuli. I want to make sure, as most experimental people do, that everything is the exact same, minus the one thing that you are manipulating. And in a lot of times, if you don't have that stimuli, it's almost impossible to tell if there was internal validity within that. So then in stage 3 is usually towards the end when the report is due, to go through and do the deep read and then connect it to almost this, again, framework of going through, looking at the positioning, looking at the introduction, looking to see if there's a roadmap at the end of that introduction to give the reader kind of a sense of the big picture, a really thorough description of methods and procedures. I feel like that is something that maybe because of the constraints of the word limit that we have, I tend to see some authors skipping some really, really, really crucial things about the study and the procedure. To me, that's important. I want to know the sample. I want to know the sample demographics. I want to know the sample psychographics, right? This is an advertising journal. Demographics are somewhat dead, right? We want psychographics on top of that. So things like that, again, for me, that's just a 3-step process. And I do spend much more time on papers that I love rather than ones that it's like a little bit more lukewarm, because I think you're just more intrinsically motivated to want to see that paper in press. And then when you do, it's really exciting knowing that you had the ability to shape and frame that story for them.
It's funny. I think I use a very similar 3-step process when I'm a reviewer too. I look at, is this in my wheelhouse? And then my first read, I go to the tables and I'm looking for the descriptives. I can't tell you how many times I don't see the descriptive data, correlation matrices, things like that. And so I want to know, what are the results? Are there strong enough results to make this interesting before I wade through the literature review?
And I get it. We're all authors too. It's hard because tables and figures take up an entire page. Most guidelines say you need to have a table or a figure on each individual page. So I do have complete empathy and personal understanding of why sometimes as authors, we don't provide that correlation matrix, right? Or that covariance matrix, because it takes up 2 pages, right? So there's got to be a way to at least make sure that the very basic things that need to be disclosed to make an informed decision are there. Don't make the reviewer pick it apart and say, like, I need this, 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 and this. That's why I love friendly reviews. That's why I love conferences. No matter what conference it is, even going outside of your discipline is a great idea to get feedback. I've personally never submitted a journal paper that has never been presented at a major national conference and or to doctoral students and or to a seminar, and I bug my friends. Come on, can you just check out the research questions, right? And I feel like if you take that extra step, yes, it slows you down a month or so, but it's really will help you in the review process.
Yeah. I'd also like to point out that the JR does actually encourage people to integrate their tables and their figures into the paper as opposed to at the back, which as a reviewer, I like that better. I mean, yeah, I have to flip through the pages to find it if I'm doing that second read, but it's just so much easier when you do that really deep read that the data is right where they're talking about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I definitely, to echo all of you, each of you, is include all that stuff that we want to see. And you've got the web appendix, you can use it from the get-go, but the number of studies I've seen where people have not included their stimuli, and it's inevitably going to be a question, right? So you're just adding an extra whole step to the process. So I encourage you to put that in, even if it's as a web appendix, in case reviewers want to see it, we can always cut it or take it out if we need to, but it's good to include that and the details of how you did your sampling, how you did your studies, all that kind of stuff as well. Very important. We're down to a few minutes left. So any final tips to get authors, help authors have their papers accepted and, get out in press?
I guess one last thing I would like to add, I'm not sure we hit on enough, which is that the behavioral outcomes are really important, that you can't just have process variables as your dependent variables in advertising. You can't just have intent. I mean, at least you need intent, right? But if there's any way to get actual behavior, that'd be great, but we can't start with just, stop with just attitudes. We need to see some intent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And to build on that point, really cool and novel and unique, yet relevant DVs are important too. We see so many times the same dependent variables over and over. So if you have an industry relevant DV, use it. Yeah.
I also think topic choice. I think topic choice is a big one. I think, look at ad age, look at work, look at, popular press that you see and see what are the issues that advertisers care about. I think if you've got a really cool topic, we're going to give you more leeway. We're going to work with you and help you develop your paper because it is cool and it's interesting. Like Angeline said, if we're excited by your paper, we're going to want to help you and want to see that out in print. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you both, Angeline and Kim, for coming and sharing all your expertise and experience today. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our watchers or viewers do as well, too. Thank you again for taking the time to be here. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out by email.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.